What if I told you that for most of early American history, Christmas was either illegal, considered suspiciously pagan, or celebrated by firing muskets into the sky at dawn? The Christmas, the trees, the Santa Claus, the family gatherings, the shopping, the stress, is less than 200 years old in its current form. Before that, Americans were still figuring out whether Christmas should exist at all, and if it did, what it should look like. Some banned it entirely. Some threw multi-day parties that would exhaust a modern wedding planner. Some quietly put up trees while their neighbors watched in confusion, wondering why anyone would bring a dying plant indoors. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Now get comfortable. Pour yourself another glass of eggnog, turn on the Christmas tree lights, and settle in. For the next couple of hours, we're going to explore the forgotten Christmas traditions that shaped America. The weird, the rowdy, the quietly beautiful customs that evolved into the holiday we simultaneously love and find completely exhausting. Starting with the Puritans, who hated Christmas so much they made it a crime. Forgotten Christmas traditions in early America and how they shaped the nation. Christmas in the colonies. When Christmas was banned in New England, the Puritans hated Christmas, not in a bah humbug way, in a we will fine you 5 shillings if you take the day off work way. When the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts in 1620, they brought with them a very specific vision of how a godly society should function. And that vision did not include festive celebrations, excessive eating, or anything that remotely resembled fun. To the Puritans, Christmas was a Catholic invention. Possibly worse, a pagan one. They'd done the research, read the historical texts, and determined that December 25th was almost certainly not Jesus' actual birthday. The date had been chosen, they believed, to coincide with Roman winter solstice festivals. Saturnalia, Sol Invictus, all that pagan revelry repackaged with a Christian veneer, and the Puritans wanted no part of it. In England, Christmas had become associated with excess, feasting that lasted for days, drinking that started at dawn, rowdy games, pranks, social inversions where servants would mock their masters. The Puritans looked at this and saw moral decay. They saw people celebrating Christ's birth by doing things Christ would absolutely not have approved of. So when they built their new society in New England, they simply didn't celebrate Christmas. In 1659, the Massachusetts Bay Colony made it official. The General Court passed a law that stated, "Whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way, would be fined 5 shillings. 5 shillings was not nothing. For a laborer, that might represent several days' wages. The law was serious, and it was enforced. You could not take the day off work, you could not cook a special meal, you could not decorate your home. If you were caught doing any of these things on December 25th, you paid. Imagine explaining that to a child. Yes, today is the day Jesus was supposedly born, but we're going to ignore it entirely and go to work because observing it is illegal and also probably sinful. The Puritans believed that the only holy days worth observing were the Sabbath and days of public thanksgiving or fasting declared by the government. Everything else was unnecessary at best, idolatrous at worst. And so December 25th passed in New England like any other winter day. People worked, they went about their business, they did not exchange gifts, they did not sing carols, they certainly did not put up decorations. This ban remained in effect for 22 years. It was repealed in 1681, but the cultural attitude persisted for much longer. Even after the law was gone, celebrating Christmas in New England was socially frowned upon. You might not be fined, but your neighbors would certainly talk. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that Christmas started to gain acceptance in New England. German and Irish immigrants brought their traditions. Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol in 1843, which helped rehabilitate the holiday's image. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert popularized Christmas trees in England, and Americans noticed. But for more than 2 centuries, New England Christmas was essentially non existent. And here's where it gets interesting. This Puritan rejection of Christmas helped shape what we now call the American work ethic. The Puritans believed in the virtue of labor. Work was not just necessary for survival, it was morally good. Idleness was dangerous. Your value as a person was tied directly to your productivity, your diligence, your refusal to waste time on frivolous pursuits. This attitude became baked into American culture. The idea that taking time off is somehow suspect, that busyness equals worthiness, that you should always be doing something productive. Even today, Americans take fewer vacation days than workers in most other developed countries. We check email on holidays. We feel guilty about resting. We valorize the entrepreneur who works 80-hour weeks. That impulse, that nagging sense that leisure is lazy, has roots in Puritan Massachusetts, where even celebrating the birth of Christ was considered an unacceptable waste of time. The Puritans are long gone, but their attitude toward work and rest lingers like a ghost in the American psyche. We've turned Christmas into a commercial juggernaut, sure, but we've also kept this strange relationship with the holiday where it's both sacred and slightly guilty, both mandatory and exhausting. You can thank the Puritans for that particular contradiction. But of course, not all of colonial America shared New England's grim determination to ignore Christmas, Southern feasting, and festivities. If you wanted to actually enjoy Christmas in colonial America, you went south, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas. These colonies had a very different attitude toward December 25th. They were settled primarily by Anglicans who had no theological problem with Christmas. In fact, they rather liked it. Christmas in the colonial South was a festival, a multi-day celebration that involved feasting, drinking, dancing, hunting, and general merriment. It was loud, excessive, and unapologetically fun. The wealthy plantation owners would throw massive parties. We're talking days-long affairs with more food than anyone could reasonably eat, enough alcohol to sedate a small army, and entertainment that would last well into the night. Guests would arrive from neighboring plantations, traveling by horse or carriage through the winter cold. They'd stay for days, sometimes weeks. The host was expected to provide not just hospitality, but spectacle. Tables would be loaded with roasted meats, whole pigs, venison, turkey, goose, beef. There would be pies, puddings, cakes, imported delicacies like oranges and almonds for those who could afford them. Everything seasoned heavily because subtlety was for Lent, not Christmas. The alcohol flowed freely. Rum punch, hard cider, wine for those with the means to import it, whiskey for everyone else. People drank in the morning, they drank with meals, they drank between meals. By the end of the day, the distinction between festive and dangerously intoxicated was often blurry. Dancing was a central part of the celebration. Not formal ballroom dancing necessarily, though that happened too. But also folk dances, reels, jigs, the kind of dancing where you grab a partner and spin until you're dizzy and the room becomes a pleasant blur of candlelight and laughter. George Washington's diaries mention Christmas celebrations at Mount Vernon. He'd note the arrival of guests, the meals served, the activities planned. Washington was a gracious host who enjoyed entertaining, and Christmas gave him an excuse to do it properly. On Christmas Day in 1769, he recorded that he went a-hunting with several companions and neighbors. Hunting was a traditional Christmas activity in the South. Groups of men would go out with dogs and guns to chase foxes or deer, not necessarily because they needed the meat, though that was welcome, but because it was sport, camaraderie, a way to mark the day as special. Women would remain at the house, supervising the preparation of the feast, entertaining arriving guests, managing the controlled chaos of a household full of visitors. It was work, but It was also an opportunity to display skill and hospitality, which was a valued social currency. Enslaved people in the South often received a few days off during Christmas, not out of benevolence exactly, but because it was tradition. They'd have their own celebrations, gatherings, music, dancing, storytelling. For a brief window, the relentless labor of plantation life would pause, and there'd be space to breathe, to remember, to maintain the cultural traditions that slavery tried to erase. Some enslaved people would receive small gifts from their enslavers, a piece of cloth perhaps, or extra food rations. These gifts were not kindness. They were part of the paternalistic system that sought to make bondage seem tolerable. But the enslaved community made their own meaning from the holiday, creating joy in circumstances designed to prevent it. In the towns and smaller farms of the South, Christmas was less grand but still festive. Families would gather. There'd be a special meal, even if it was more modest. Church services in the morning, visiting neighbors in the afternoon, perhaps a small dance or gathering in the evening. One curious tradition that emerged in parts of the South was Christmas fireworks. Yes, fireworks. In the 1700s, wealthy families would sometimes set off small explosives, not the elaborate aerial displays we have now, but crude gunpowder charges that made noise and flash. It was dramatic, it was expensive, it was absolutely not safe by modern standards. The fireworks served the same purpose as church bells in Europe, announcing the holiday, marking it as special, creating a sensory experience that separated this day from all the others. Neighbors would hear the booms echoing across the winter landscape and know that Christmas had arrived at the big house down the road. Children in the South grew up expecting Christmas to be exciting. They'd receive small gifts, perhaps a toy carved from wood, a piece of candy, a ribbon. Nothing like the mountains of presents modern American children expect, but enough to make the day memorable. The contrast between North and South on this issue was stark. A child in Massachusetts might not even know it was Christmas unless someone mentioned it in passing. A child in Virginia would be counting down the days, anticipating the feast, the gathering, the rare moment when adults seemed less serious and more inclined toward indulgence. This regional split, Puritan restraint versus Anglican celebration, would persist for generations. It created different cultural attitudes toward leisure, pleasure, and the role of holidays in society. The South's embrace of Christmas as a festive, communal celebration would eventually influence the rest of the country as regional differences softened and national traditions began to emerge. But in the colonial period, the divide was real, and it said something fundamental about the different visions of American society that were taking shape. If you were a colonist trying to escape Puritan severity, moving south was an option. If you wanted to avoid what you saw as frivolous excess, New England offered moral certainty and hard work. America was big enough to contain both impulses, but there was a third way, quieter and less noticed, emerging in Pennsylvania. Quiet Quaker and Pennsylvania German traditions. Between the Puritan ban in New England and the lavish feasts in the South, there existed a middle path. The Quakers found it. The Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, arrived in Pennsylvania in the late 1600s, led by William Penn, who'd been granted the colony as repayment for a debt the English crown owed his father. Penn envisioned Pennsylvania as a holy experiment, a place where religious tolerance and peaceful coexistence could actually work. The Quakers had their own complicated relationship with Christmas. They didn't ban it, exactly, but they didn't celebrate it either. Quakers rejected most traditional religious holidays because they believed every day was equally holy. Singling out December 25th seemed arbitrary, even a bit presumptuous. Who were humans to declare certain days more sacred than others? So, while Quakers didn't find people for celebrating Christmas the way Puritans did, they also didn't mark the day with any special observance. December 25th was simply the 25th day of the 12th month. Work continued. Life went on. This was less about hostility and more about principle. Quakers stripped away what they saw as unnecessary ceremony from their faith. Their meetings were silent unless someone felt moved by the Spirit to speak. Their buildings were plain. Their clothing was simple. They called each other thee and thou because elaborate titles seemed to elevate some people above others, and Quakers believed in fundamental equality. Christmas excess, the feasting, the drinking, the social hierarchy on display, ran counter to everything Quakers valued. But here's where it gets interesting. Pennsylvania also became home to German immigrants, many of whom were Lutherans and Reformed Christians who absolutely did celebrate Christmas. These Pennsylvania Germans, often called Pennsylvania Dutch, though Dutch was a corruption of Deutsch, brought their own traditions, and those traditions were quiet, communal, and centered around the home. Pennsylvania German Christmas was not about grand parties or public displays. It was about family, simple pleasures, and handmade expressions of love. On Christmas Eve, families would gather in their homes. They'd prepare a special meal, nothing extravagant, but nicer than everyday fare. Roasted meat if they could afford it. Fresh bread, preserved fruits from the summer harvest, perhaps a simple sweet cake flavored with spices. The Pennsylvania Germans introduced the Christmas tree to America, though it took a while to catch on. In their homeland, German families had been decorating evergreen trees for generations. The tradition had roots in medieval mystery plays and earlier pagan customs that had been absorbed into Christian practice. But to Germans, the tree was meaningful, a symbol of life persisting through winter's death. They'd cut a small fir or pine and bring it indoors. Decorations were homemade and modest, strings of popcorn or berries, paper ornaments cut by hand, perhaps a few candles carefully attached to branches with wire. Nothing electric, obviously. Nothing mass-produced. Everything made with care by people who understood that beauty didn't require expense. When Pennsylvania Germans first erected Christmas trees in their homes, their English neighbors thought it was strange, wasteful even. Why bring a tree indoors? It would die. It would drop needles. It served no practical purpose, but the Germans persisted, and slowly, over decades, the practice spread. By the mid-1800s, Christmas trees were appearing in homes across America. But in the colonial period, it was still mostly a Pennsylvania German tradition, practiced quietly and without fanfare. Gifts in Pennsylvania German households were simple. Children might receive a carved wooden toy, a horse, a doll, a simple puzzle, or something practical. Warm socks, a new cap, a book if the family valued education and could afford one. The emphasis was on making things by hand. Store-bought gifts were rare simply because stores had limited inventory and most people had limited money. But the handmade nature of gifts wasn't just about economics, it was about intention. A father would spend evenings by candlelight, carving a toy for his child, thinking about their interests, their age, what would bring them joy. A mother would knit socks or sew a simple dress, choosing colors carefully, making sure the fit was right. The gift wasn't just the object. It was the time spent making it, the thought embedded in every stitch or cut. This attitude toward gift giving, that it should be personal, meaningful, thoughtful, rather than expensive, became part of American Christmas culture. Even now, when commercialism threatens to overwhelm the holiday, there's still this lingering sense that the best gifts are the ones that show you really know someone, that you took time to consider what they'd actually want. That impulse has roots in Pennsylvania German parlors, where children unwrapped handmade treasures on Christmas morning and understood that love looked like their father's calloused hands and their mother's patient needlework. Pennsylvania German communities also emphasized Christmas as a time for helping neighbors. If someone in the community was struggling, widowed, sick, fallen on hard times, Christmas was when you showed up. You'd bring food, firewood, help with chores, not with great ceremony or public recognition because that would violate Quaker and German sensibilities about pride and humility. You just do it. This quiet charity was different from the Southern tradition of wealthy families preparing baskets for the poor, which had an element of noblesse oblige, a performance of class hierarchy. Pennsylvania German charity was more peer to peer. We're all in this together. You need help now, I might need help next year. We take care of each other. The Quakers, despite not celebrating Christmas themselves, approved of this approach. They'd often participate in winter charity efforts, making sure community members had what they needed to survive the cold months, though they'd do it in late December without specifically calling it Christmas charity. Children in Pennsylvania, German households grew up learning that Christmas wasn't about accumulation. It was about appreciation, about noticing the small beauties, the candlelight on the tree, the taste of a special cake, the warmth of the house while snow fell outside. This created a different kind of childhood memory than either Puritan denial or Southern excess. It was moderate, intentional, centered on relationships rather than spectacle. Pennsylvania German hymnody also influenced American Christmas music. Songs like Lo, How, a Rose E'er Blooming came from German Lutheran traditions. The melodies were simple enough for ordinary people to sing, but beautiful enough to feel transcendent. In churches on Christmas Day, Pennsylvania Germans would sing these hymns in four-part harmony, voices blending in cold sanctuaries while dawn light filtered through plain windows. The music was the decoration. The voices were the celebration. This emphasis on communal singing, on making music together as an expression of joy and worship, planted seeds that would eventually grow into the American caroling tradition. But in colonial Pennsylvania, it was quieter, more intimate, less performative. The Quaker and Pennsylvania German approach to Christmas, or the deliberate non-approach in the Quakers' case, created a cultural counterweight to both Puritan severity and Southern grandeur. It offered a model of celebration that was accessible to ordinary people. You didn't need wealth to have a meaningful Christmas. You didn't need to throw elaborate parties or import expensive delicacies. You needed a tree from the woods, some string and paper, your family, your voice. This democratization of the holiday would become increasingly important as America developed its national identity. Christmas couldn't just be for the wealthy. It had to work for farmers, laborers, immigrants, people building lives with limited resources. The Pennsylvania model showed that it could. And as different regional traditions began to mix, as New Englanders moved west, as Southerners migrated north, as German customs spread beyond Pennsylvania, elements from all three approaches would blend into something recognizably American. The Puritan influence would make Americans slightly guilty about too much celebration, always a little worried about excess. The Southern influence would make Americans crave festivity, big gatherings, abundance, and the Pennsylvania German influence would make Americans value handmade touches, personal gestures, the idea that Christmas should be warm and communal rather than cold and transactional. You can see all three impulses in modern American Christmas. The stress about spending too much money and being too materialistic, that's Puritan guilt. The enormous meals and elaborate light displays and multi-day celebrations, that's Southern festivity. The handmade ornaments and the emphasis on the true meaning of Christmas being about family and love, that's Pennsylvania German simplicity. We're still negotiating between these visions, trying to find the right balance, feeling like we never quite get it right. Which makes sense because even in the beginning, in the colonial period when these traditions were first taking root in American soil, There was no single, unified vision of what Christmas should be. There was only a collection of different peoples from different places with different beliefs, trying to figure out how to mark the turning of the year in this strange new world they'd found themselves building. Some banned it, some feasted, some quietly sang hymns and carved wooden toys by firelight. And somehow, eventually, all of these approaches would merge and evolve into the chaotic, contradictory, exhausting, joyful, commercial, sentimental holiday we know today. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in the colonial period, still watching these traditions take shape, still decades away from Christmas becoming the cultural behemoth it would eventually become. For now, in the 1600s and 1700s, Christmas was regional, contested, uncertain. It meant different things to different people. It was banned in some places and required in others. It was an opportunity for joy or a temptation towards sin, depending on who you asked. And that complexity, that refusal to be just one thing, was perhaps the most American quality Christmas would ever possess. The holiday was still finding its shape, still figuring out what it wanted to be when it grew up, much like America itself. But already, even in these early fragmented traditions, you could see the outlines of something that would eventually become central to American culture: the tension between work and rest, the desire for community alongside the reality of diversity, the attempt to create meaning and connection in a landscape that often felt harsh and isolating. Christmas in colonial America wasn't pretty. It wasn't unified. It wasn't the nostalgic fantasy we sometimes imagine when we think about old-fashioned Christmas. It was messier than that, more interesting, more human. The Puritans going to work on December 25th with grim determination, trying to prove their devotion through denial. The Southern planters raising toasts in candlelit rooms, laughing too loud, trying to push back the winter darkness with noise and light. The Pennsylvania Germans hanging apples on a pine tree in their parlor, teaching their children to sing, showing them that celebration could be gentle and small and still matter. All of them were building something, whether they knew it or not. Building traditions that would outlast them, that would be copied and modified and passed down until they became so familiar, we'd forget they were ever new. And maybe that's the real gift of these forgotten Christmas traditions. Not the specific practices themselves, but the reminder that everything we think of as timeless was once invented, contested, strange. Someone had to be the first person to put a tree in their living room. Someone had to argue that December 25th should be a day off work in a culture that thought rest was suspect. Those someones were colonial Americans, fumbling their way through winter, trying to create moments of light and warmth and connection in lives that were often dark and cold and lonely. They didn't know they were creating American Christmas. They were just trying to survive the winter, mark the season, find something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. But that's how traditions start, isn't it? Not with grand plans or official decrees, but with ordinary people making choices about how to observe the passage of time, how to mark what matters, how to build small moments of joy in the middle of everything else. The colonists did that. In New England and Virginia and Pennsylvania and everywhere else, people were trying to build lives in this new land. They took what they'd known in Europe, adapted it to American circumstances, argued about it, banned it, celebrated it, and eventually created something that was neither entirely European nor entirely new, but some hybrid thing that could only have happened here. And we're still living with the results, still negotiating the same tensions, still trying to figure out how to celebrate Christmas in a way that feels authentic and meaningful and not completely exhausting. The colonists started that conversation. We're still having it. Which means that when you're stressed about Christmas shopping, or arguing with relatives about holiday plans, or trying to figure out how to make the season feel special without going bankrupt or losing your mind. You're participating in a tradition that's almost 400 years old. Americans have always struggled with Christmas, have always felt like we're doing it wrong, or that it's too much, or that it's not enough, or that we've lost the real meaning somewhere between the demands of work and the pressure to create perfect memories. That struggle is the tradition. That's what we inherited from the colonists. Along with the trees and the gifts and the carols, the feeling that Christmas should be important, that it should mean something, but we're never quite sure what exactly, and we're definitely not sure we're celebrating it correctly. The Puritans felt that way. So did the Southern planters and the Pennsylvania Germans and everyone else trying to figure out how to mark December 25th in a meaningful way. We're in good company, is what I'm saying. And maybe there's something comforting in that. In knowing that Christmas has always been complicated, has always been contested, has always required negotiation between competing values and visions. It's not just us. It's not just now. It's always been this way. The colonists were doing their best with what they had, making it up as they went along, trying to create something worth passing down to their children, and they succeeded in their messy, imperfect way. We're still here, still celebrating, still arguing about the right way to do it, still trying to find meaning in the dark middle of winter, still putting up trees and giving gifts, and gathering with people we love, or at least people we're related to, and attempting to create warmth when the world outside is cold. That impulse, that stubborn insistence on celebration in the face of winter's harshness, that's what the colonists gave us. Along with guilt about resting and anxiety about excess, and the conviction that handmade gifts matter more than expensive ones, and the belief that Christmas should involve food and family and some kind of light pushing back against the darkness. They gave us all of that, wrapped up in traditions they'd borrowed and adapted and invented and argued about until those traditions became distinctly, unmistakably American. And now here we are, centuries later, still figuring it out, still carrying forward what they started, still trying to have the Christmas we think we should have, while also trying to survive the Christmas we actually have, still seeking that balance between restraint and celebration, between tradition and innovation, between what we inherited and what we want to create. The colonists would understand. They were doing the exact same thing, just with more muskets and fewer credit cards. But the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. How do you mark time? How do you create meaning? How do you make winter more bearable? Christmas was their answer. Messy, conflicted, regional, but an answer nonetheless. And that answer, despite everything, despite all the ways it's been commercialized and complicated and argued over, still works. We're still here, still celebrating, still looking for light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, connection in isolation, still doing what the colonists did in our own way, with our own tools and challenges and hopes, still trying to make Christmas mean something, even when we're not entirely sure what that something is. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all it ever needed to be. A collection of people doing their best, trying to create moments that matter, hoping that what they build will last just a little bit longer than they will. The colonists succeeded at that. Their traditions outlasted them by centuries. And maybe ours will too. Maybe someone generations from now will look back at our Christmas and see in it the same mix of devotion and commerce, tradition and innovation that we see in colonial Christmas. Maybe they'll be just as confused and conflicted as we are. Maybe they'll still be trying to figure out the right way to celebrate. And maybe they'll find comfort, as we do, in knowing that this struggle is the tradition, that uncertainty is part of the heritage, that every generation has to figure out Christmas for themselves, has to make it their own, has to negotiate between what they inherited and what they need. The colonists started that process. We continue it. Whoever comes after us will inherit it, and the tree will still be there in one form or another. The gifts will still matter in some way. The gathering will still happen somehow, because that's what humans do. We mark time. We create ritual. We build traditions that help us survive the darkness and celebrate the light. The colonists knew that. They did it with the tools and beliefs they had. We're doing it with ours. And the tradition continues, unbroken, adapting but enduring, from their time to ours and beyond. That's the real gift they gave us. Not the specific customs, which have mostly changed beyond recognition, but the template. The understanding that Christmas is whatever we make it, that it can be banned or celebrated, simple or elaborate, sacred or secular, and it still serves the same fundamental purpose. It still marks the turning of the year, still creates a break in ordinary time, still gives us a reason to gather, to give, to pause, and notice that we're still here, still carrying on, still finding ways to create light in the darkness. The colonists did that in their way. We do it in ours. And the fact that it's hard, that it's complicated, that we never quite get it right, that's not a failure. That's the tradition itself. That's what it means to have an American Christmas. Messy, contested, evolving, imperfect, but ours. And worth preserving, worth passing down, worth the effort it takes to figure out how to do it just a little bit better than last year. The colonists would understand that too. They were always trying to improve, to refine, to create something worth keeping. They succeeded. And so can we, in our own way, with our own struggles and hopes. That's the real lesson of colonial Christmas. Not the specific traditions which are mostly lost or transformed beyond recognition, but the understanding that tradition itself is fluid, that it has to be, that each generation's task is to take what they've inherited and make it work for the world they actually live in. The colonists did that. We're doing it. The future will do it too. And Christmas will continue in whatever form it takes, as long as humans need a way to mark the darkness, celebrate the light, and remind themselves that winter always ends, spring always comes, and we're capable of creating warmth even when the world is cold. That's what the colonists knew. That's what they tried to teach us through their traditions and arguments and compromises, and we're still learning, still trying, still figuring out how to have a Christmas that means something without crushing us under its weight, still doing our best, just like they did, still building something worth passing down to the people who come after us. And that, ultimately, is the most American Christmas tradition of all. Not perfection, not certainty, not a single unified vision of how it should be done, but the stubborn, persistent effort to create something meaningful anyway, to try, to adapt, to keep going. That's what the colonists gave us. That's the tradition we inherited. That's what we'll pass along in turn to whoever comes next. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it always was. Forgotten customs Americans once practiced. So we've established that colonial Americans had wildly different approaches to Christmas depending on where they lived and what they believed. But even in places where Christmas was celebrated, the actual customs would seem strange to us now. Alien even, because Americans once celebrated Christmas in ways we've completely forgotten. Traditions that thrived for decades or even centuries, then vanished so thoroughly that most people today have no idea they ever existed, Let's talk about those. Mumming and Christmas mischief. Imagine this. It's December 26th. You're sitting in your Philadelphia home in 1795, trying to recover from yesterday's Christmas festivities, when suddenly there's pounding on your door. You open it. Outside stands a group of people in bizarre costumes. Some are wearing masks. Others have their faces painted or covered with cloth. They're dressed as animals, as characters from folklore, as the opposite gender, as anything that makes them unrecognizable. And they want to come inside. This was mumming, also called mummering or Christmas masquerading. And it was huge in early America, particularly in Philadelphia and other mid-Atlantic cities. The tradition came from England, Ireland, and Scotland, brought over by immigrants who'd been doing it for generations. The basic concept: during the Christmas season, groups of people would disguise themselves, go door to door, perform short plays or skits, sing songs, tell jokes, and generally cause controlled chaos. The disguises were essential. You weren't supposed to recognize who was behind the mask. Part of the fun was guessing. Was that your neighbor? Your cousin? Some stranger from 3 streets over? The anonymity created a temporary social leveling. Rich and poor could mingle. Servants could mock masters. All the normal hierarchies got suspended for a few hours. Mummers would knock on doors expecting to be let in. Once inside, they'd perform. The performances varied wildly in quality. Some groups rehearsed elaborate plays based on folk tales. St. George slaying the dragon was popular, or Robin Hood stories. Others just made up nonsense on the spot, the quality depending heavily on how much they'd already had to drink. Homeowners were expected to provide hospitality. Food, drink, coins if you had them to spare. If you were wealthy, mummers might expect something more substantial. If you were working class, a cup of cider and some bread would suffice. The whole thing walked a fine line between festive fun and threatening chaos. Because here's the thing. A group of disguised strangers showing up at your door demanding entry is inherently unsettling. Most of the time, mummers were harmless, neighbors having fun, continuing tradition, but sometimes things went wrong. Sometimes people drank too much and the performances became aggressive. Sometimes fights broke out. Sometimes the line between playful mischief and actual vandalism got blurry. By the early 1800s, Philadelphia's mumming tradition had gotten rowdy enough that city officials started getting nervous. There were reports of mummers damaging property, harassing residents, starting brawls. The disguises made it impossible to hold anyone accountable. In 1808, Philadelphia actually tried to ban masquerading during the Christmas season. The law didn't stick. The tradition was too popular. But it showed growing tension between the old rowdy customs and the emerging desire for a more orderly, respectable Christmas. Over time, mumming evolved. It became more organized, more theatrical, less anarchic. By the late 1800s, Philadelphia's mummers had formed official clubs and put on elaborate New Year's Day parades that still happen today. The Mummers Parade is now a regulated spectacle with permits and judges and corporate sponsors, but in the colonial and early federal period, mumming was wilder, less controlled, more genuinely strange. The custom existed in other cities too, though Philadelphia was the epicenter. New York had some mumming. So did parts of Maryland and rural Pennsylvania. Anywhere you had enough density of English, Irish, or Scottish immigrants, you might find mummers roaming the streets during Christmas week. The tradition even spread to Newfoundland, where mummering became so embedded in the culture that it continues today in a relatively authentic form. People still dress up, still go door to door, still expect to be invited in for drinks and snacks. But in the United States, mumming mostly faded by the mid-1800s. Why? Partly urbanization. As cities grew larger and more anonymous, letting masked strangers into your home became genuinely risky rather than charmingly traditional, partly shifting class dynamics. The wealthy started seeing mumming as lower class behavior, something disorderly and potentially dangerous. Christmas was being domesticated, turned into a home centered, family focused holiday. Masked strangers demanding drinks didn't fit that vision, and partly the rise of other Christmas traditions that served similar social functions, like caroling, but in less threatening ways. Which brings us conveniently enough to our next forgotten tradition. Early American wassailing. Wassailing is a word that sounds like it should mean something nautical, but it doesn't. It comes from the Old English phrase "Wise hael," meaning be healthy or be whole. A toast, a wish for good fortune. In early America, wassailing meant groups of people going door to door during the Christmas season, singing songs and expecting to be given drinks. Usually something alcoholic and warm, like spiced cider or ale. Think of it as aggressive caroling. The tradition had roots in medieval England, where wassailers would carry a large bowl filled with spiced ale or cider, decorated with apples and ribbons. They'd visit wealthy households, sing songs of blessing and good cheer, and expect the bowl to be refilled before they left. In colonial America, particularly in the South, wassailing became Christmas tradition. Groups, sometimes organized, sometimes just neighbors who decided to make the rounds together, would travel from house to house after dark. They'd sing, not always well. Often they'd make up verses on the spot, tailored to the household they were visiting. Here we come a wassailing among the leaves so green. Here we come a wandering so fair to be seen. The songs were cheerful, sometimes slightly threatening in their cheerfulness. There was an implicit bargain. You let us in, give us drinks and food, and we'll sing you songs of blessing. Refuse, and, well, we might sing songs of cursing instead. Or just make noise until you comply. This wasn't begging exactly. It was closer to a ritualized exchange. The wassailers were performing a service, bringing Christmas cheer, offering blessings for the coming year, and expected compensation. Wealthy households generally obliged. It was good form. It demonstrated generosity. And frankly, it was easier to just give the wassailers what they wanted than to deal with a group of increasingly drunk neighbors lingering on your doorstep singing badly. Servants and enslaved people sometimes participated in wassailing, particularly in the South. For them, it was a rare opportunity to approach the big house and receive gifts, food, drink, coins, directly from their employers or enslavers. The Christmas season suspended normal hierarchies just enough to make this possible. But as with mumming, wassailing had a chaotic edge. People drank, a lot. By the third or fourth house, wassailers were often significantly intoxicated. Songs became sloppier. Behavior became less predictable. Sometimes wassailers wouldn't leave when they were supposed to. Sometimes they'd become belligerent if they felt the hospitality wasn't generous enough. Washington Irving, in his 1820 sketches about Old English Christmas traditions, described wassailing as simultaneously charming and slightly alarming. The romance of old customs mixed with the reality of drunk people demanding entry to your home. By the mid-1800s, wassailing in its traditional form was fading in America. The drinking aspect became problematic as temperance movements gained strength. The door-to-door demanding of hospitality seemed increasingly inappropriate in a society that valued privacy and property rights. But the singing part survived. It transformed into caroling, groups going door to door singing Christmas songs, but now without the expectation of being invited in for drinks. Just the singing. Sometimes collecting money for charity instead of demanding personal hospitality. This was a significant shift. Caroling removed the threat, the obligation, the potential for things to get messy. It kept the communal festive aspect of wassailing while discarding the elements that made middle class Victorians nervous. By the late 1800s, caroling had become wholesome. Groups of well dressed people singing traditional songs, maybe collecting coins for orphans or widows, then politely moving to the next house. No drinking, no demanding entry, no implicit threats. Wassailing had been domesticated into something safe, but in doing so, it lost the edge that made it genuinely interesting. That moment of not quite knowing whether the people at your door were bringing cheer or chaos, whether the evening would end with pleasant songs or a house full of drunk neighbors refusing to leave. That uncertainty, that slight danger, was part of the original Christmas spirit in early America. Not everything was wholesome. Not everything was safe and predictable. Sometimes Christmas meant opening your door to the unknown and hoping for the best. But of course, with sailors at your door singing weren't the loudest interruption you might experience during an early American Christmas. The colonial Christmas gunfire tradition. Let's talk about Christmas gunning. That's what they called it. Christmas gunning. Or Christmas shooting. The practice of firing guns into the air to celebrate Christmas Day. This was real. This was widespread. This was, for a significant period of American history, just what you did on December 25th if you owned a firearm and wanted to mark the occasion. The tradition was strongest in the South and on the frontier, but it happened in cities too. On Christmas morning as the sun rose, men would step outside with their muskets or rifles and fire into the air. Sometimes it was a single shot. Sometimes multiple. Sometimes organized groups would fire volleys in unison, creating a thunderous boom that echoed across the landscape. The noise was the point. In the absence of church bells, which many American communities couldn't afford or didn't have access to, gunfire announced the holiday. It said, "Something important is happening. Pay attention. This day is different." In rural areas, Christmas gunning served as a kind of acoustic communication network. You'd hear shots from neighboring farms, know they were celebrating, fire your own gun in response. The sound carried for miles. It connected isolated homesteads, reminded people they were part of a larger community even if they rarely saw each other. Enslaved people in the South sometimes participated in Christmas gunning when allowed access to firearms during the holiday. For them, firing a gun was a rare assertion of power, a momentary claiming of something usually forbidden. George Washington's plantation records mention Christmas gunning. Visitors to Mount Vernon described hearing shots fired on Christmas morning, both by Washington's household and by enslaved workers on the property. Thomas Jefferson tolerated Christmas gunning at Monticello, though he personally thought it was wasteful. Ammunition cost money, and firing into the air served no practical purpose. But it was tradition, and Jefferson, despite his rationalism, respected certain traditions. In cities, Christmas gunning was more controversial. Philadelphia, New York, and Boston all had periodic attempts to ban the practice. City officials worried about accidents. What goes up must come down, and falling bullets could injure people or damage property. They worried about fires being started. They worried about the general disorder of armed citizens firing weapons in the streets. But the bans were hard to enforce. People liked the tradition. It felt festive. It was loud and dramatic and democratic. Anyone with a gun could participate, regardless of wealth or status. The tradition persisted well into the 1800s. Civil War soldiers wrote letters home describing Christmas gunning in army camps. Entire regiments firing volleys at dawn on December 25th. But gradually, as America urbanized, as safety concerns increased, as Christmas became more domesticated and family-centered, the practice declined. By the early 1900s, Christmas gunning was mostly gone from cities. It lingered in rural areas, particularly in the South, but even there it became less common. Now it's illegal in most places. Firing weapons within city limits, even into the air, will get you arrested. The tradition that once seemed like a natural way to celebrate, making the loudest noise you could, announcing joy through percussion and powder, is now considered dangerous and inappropriate. But for early Americans, Christmas gunning made perfect sense. It was celebratory, it was communal, it was loud enough to compete with winter's silence. And maybe there was something else to it too. Something about firing a weapon in celebration rather than in violence, about using the tools of survival and warfare to mark a day of peace. The same gun you'd use to hunt for food, to defend your family, to fight in militia musters. On Christmas, you'd fire it into the sky, wasting ammunition purely for the joy of the noise. That waste was the point. It was extravagant. It was unnecessary. It was celebration in its purest form, doing something for no practical reason except to mark the day as special. Early Americans understood that celebration requires extravagance, that holidays need waste, need excess, need something that breaks the utilitarian logic of everyday survival. So they fired their guns into the winter sky and listened to the echoes and felt, for a moment, that life was about more than just getting through to spring. But not all Christmas extravagance was loud. Some was quiet, practical, aimed at those who had less. The lost tradition of gifts for the poor, Christmas charity in early America, looked different than it does now. Today, we have organized drives, nonprofit organizations, online donation platforms. You can give to the poor from your phone while sitting on your couch. In colonial and early federal America, Christmas charity was personal, direct, face to face. Wealthy families, particularly in the South, but also in other regions, would prepare baskets for the poor during Christmas week. These baskets contained food, sometimes clothing, occasionally coins. This wasn't random charity, it was targeted. Families would know which widows in their community were struggling, which laborers had fallen on hard times, which families had too many children and not enough resources. On Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, someone from the wealthy household, often the mistress, sometimes servants acting on her instructions, would deliver these baskets personally. The recipients were expected to be grateful, effusively grateful. This was charity as theater, as social reinforcement. The wealthy demonstrated their benevolence. The poor demonstrated their gratitude and their understanding of the social hierarchy. It was paternalistic, yes. It reinforced class divisions rather than challenging them. But it was also a genuine attempt to ensure that everyone in the community had enough to eat during the holiday, that widows and orphans weren't forgotten. The baskets might contain a ham or a piece of salt pork, flour, cornmeal, molasses, dried fruit, perhaps some coffee or tea if the family was very generous, sometimes warm clothing, a coat, blankets, wool socks. For children in poor families, there might be a small toy or sweet. Nothing extravagant. A peppermint stick, a carved wooden top, a rag doll. The gesture mattered as much as the contents. The acknowledgement that you existed, that you were part of the community's concern, that you wouldn't be left to face winter entirely alone. Plantation owners would distribute gifts to enslaved people during Christmas. Extra food rations, cloth for new clothes, sometimes small luxuries like tobacco or sugar. This was part of the paternalistic system that tried to make slavery seem benevolent, to create the fiction that enslavers cared about the people they held in bondage. Enslaved people accepted these gifts because refusing wasn't really an option, but they understood exactly what the gifts represented. Not kindness, control. An attempt to manufacture loyalty and gratitude for the small mercy of slightly less deprivation. In northern cities, churches organized Christmas charity. Congregations would collect funds throughout December, then distribute food and fuel to poor families. Quakers, despite not celebrating Christmas themselves, often participated in winter charity efforts. They'd provide firewood, food, clothing to those in need, viewing it as simply the right thing to do regardless of the calendar. The tradition of Christmas charity evolved throughout the 1800s. It became more organized, less personal. Charitable societies formed. Orphanages and poorhouses held special Christmas celebrations. By the late 1800s, Christmas charity was becoming institutionalized. The Salvation Army started its Christmas kettle campaigns. Settlement houses organized Christmas parties for immigrant children. Wealthy families still gave, but increasingly through organizations rather than directly. Something was lost in that transition. The personal connection. The acknowledgement of specific people with specific needs. But something was gained too. Efficiency, reach, the ability to help more people without the requirement of gratitude theater. Modern Christmas charity, the toy drives, the food banks, the angel trees, descends from those early American traditions of preparing baskets for the poor. We've kept the impulse. The sense that Christmas should be a time when those with more help, those with less. But we've removed most of the personal contact, the direct exchange, the uncomfortable face-to-face encounter with poverty and need. Whether that's better or worse depends on your perspective. The early American version was more intimate, but more paternalistic. The modern version is more efficient, but more anonymous. Both try to answer the same question. What do we owe each other? How do we ensure that everyone, regardless of wealth, can participate in the celebration? Early Americans answered with baskets and personal visits and the expectation of gratitude. We answer with online donations and tax deductions and the comfort of helping without having to look anyone in the eye. Different approaches, same underlying impulse. The recognition that a holiday celebrated only by those who can afford it isn't really a holiday for everyone, and that meant, in practical terms, that gifts needed to be accessible to all, not just the wealthy. Handmade toys and practical gifts. Here's what Christmas morning looked like for most American children in the 1700s and early 1800s. You'd wake up. Maybe there'd be a special breakfast, cornmeal mush with molasses, or, if your family was doing well, bacon. Then you'd receive your Christmas gift. One gift. Singular. If you were lucky, it was a toy. A carved wooden horse. A corn husk doll. A ball made from bundled rags. Something your father had made during long winter evenings, whittling by candlelight, or your mother had sewn from fabric scraps. If you were practical-minded or your family was struggling, your gift might be socks, or a new shirt, or a primer for learning to read. These weren't disappointing gifts, understand? They were useful, necessary, given with love and received with genuine appreciation, because children understood that resources were limited and everything cost effort. The handmade nature of gifts wasn't a charming choice. It was necessity. There weren't toy stores. Mail order catalogs didn't exist until the late 1800s. If you wanted a toy, someone had to make it. Fathers carved. Mothers sewed. Older siblings helped. The process of making Christmas gifts was itself part of the family's winter routine. A father might spend weeks on a wooden toy, choosing the right piece of wood, something that would carve cleanly without too many knots, rough shaping it with a knife, refining the details, sanding it smooth so there'd be no splinters, maybe painting it if paint was available, or leaving it natural. The toy would be simple. Wooden horses were popular. Every child knew horses, understood their value, wanted one to play with. Spinning tops, balls, simple wagons, whistles, carved animals. For girls, dolls, usually cloth dolls stuffed with corn husks or straw. with faces stitched or painted on. If the family had scraps of nice fabric, the doll might have a dress. If not, the doll would be plain. These toys weren't meant to be realistic. They were meant to be durable, to survive months or years of play. Children played with the same toy for ages. They didn't expect new toys regularly. One toy at Christmas, maybe another at their birthday if they were fortunate. That was it. So the toys mattered. They were treasured. Names were given, stories were invented. A simple wooden horse became a companion, a character in elaborate, imaginative games that could last for months. Practical gifts were even more common. A boy might receive a knife, his first real knife, not a toy. This was a significant gift, a tool he'd use for the rest of his life, for work and craft and hunting. A girl might receive a sewing kit. Needles, thread, a thimble, fabric scraps. The gift said, "You're old enough now to contribute, to make things, to help maintain the household." And books were precious gifts. Most families owned few books. Maybe a Bible, an almanac, not much else. Receiving a book meant someone thought you were worth investing in intellectually. Clothing was a practical necessity. Children outgrew things quickly. A new shirt, a warm coat, sturdy boots. These were expensive, valuable, genuinely needed. The gift giving wasn't elaborate. No wrapping paper. That didn't become common until the late 1800s. Gifts might be placed in a stocking hung by the fireplace, or simply handed over during breakfast. There was no pile of presents, no frenzy of unwrapping, no disappointment over getting the wrong thing because expectations were calibrated to reality. You received one item. You said thank you. You appreciated it because you understood the work that went into it and the sacrifice it might have required. This created a different relationship to material goods. Things were valued because they were scarce, because they represented labor, because they lasted. A wooden toy carved by your father wasn't just a toy. It was proof that he'd thought about you, spent time for you, put his skill into creating something specifically for your joy. That matters differently than purchasing something mass-produced. Both are gifts. Both express care. But the handmade gift carries the weight of time spent, effort invested, thought given to what would make this specific child happy. Modern Americans sometimes try to recapture this by making homemade gifts. A knitted scarf, a batch of cookies, a photo album assembled by hand. These efforts are admirable. They recognize that the personal touch matters, that not everything should be transactional and commercial. But we've lost the context that made handmade gifts necessary rather than optional. We make them as a choice, as a statement against commercialism, not because we have no alternative. Early American children didn't have that choice. Handmade was all there was. And maybe there was something valuable in that constraint. Something about learning that celebration doesn't require abundance. That gifts can be simple and still meaningful. That what matters isn't the quantity or expense, but the intention and the care. These are easy sentiments to romanticize. Early American childhood wasn't idyllic. It was hard. Children worked. Many didn't survive to adulthood. Poverty was real and harsh. But within that hardship, there was also this: the understanding that you could create joy with very little, that a carved wooden horse and a day off from chores could constitute a celebration, that family and warmth and one special meal mattered more than material abundance. That lesson, that Christmas could be meaningful without excess, is worth remembering. Not because we should return to handmade-only gifts or single-item Christmases. We have options our ancestors didn't have, and that's good. But because the impulse they had to create celebration within constraints, to find joy in simple things, to recognize that The thought truly does matter more than the expense. That impulse is worth preserving. It's the antidote to the modern anxiety that we're never doing Christmas right, never spending enough, never creating magical enough memories. The early Americans didn't worry about creating magic. They worried about having enough firewood and flour to get through winter. Christmas was just a brief pause, a moment of warmth, a simple gift exchanged, a special meal if they could manage it. And that was enough. That was celebration. Not because they were more virtuous or less materialistic than we are, but because they understood that celebration isn't about abundance. It's about acknowledgement, about marking time, about creating moments that stand out from the ordinary flow of days. A carved wooden horse did that. A pair of warm socks did that. A book did that. They marked December 25th as different, special, worth remembering. And in that marking, in that simple gesture of giving something made with care, early Americans created a Christmas tradition that still echoes today, even though we've mostly forgotten where it came from. The idea that gifts should be thoughtful, that they should reflect knowledge of the recipient, that the best gifts aren't necessarily the most expensive, but the most personal. That started in colonial parlors and frontier cabins, with parents creating gifts by hand because they had no other option. And it endures in whatever form we can manage in our very different world with our very different challenges. The handmade gift, the practical gift, the gift that says, I thought about you, I know you, I care. That's what early Americans gave each other. And in doing so, they gave us a template for how Christmas gifts might mean something beyond their material value. Whether we use that template is up to us, but it's there, waiting, passed down from people who had very little, but understood that very little, given with love, could be enough. The birth of American Christmas symbols. So we've talked about what early Americans did during Christmas and what they stopped doing. Now let's talk about how the symbols we associate with Christmas today, the ones that feel timeless and universal, actually arrived in America and became, well, American. Because none of this was inevitable. Christmas trees weren't always here. Santa Claus didn't spring fully formed from the American imagination. Holiday markets weren't a given. These things had to be introduced, adopted, adapted, and eventually claimed as our own. And that process was messy and contested and took longer than you'd think. When Christmas trees were foreign. The first documented Christmas tree in America appeared in the 1820s in Pennsylvania, put up by German immigrants who'd brought the tradition from home. Their neighbors thought they were insane. Bring a tree indoors, let it die in your parlor, dropping needles everywhere. Waste candles decorating it. What possible purpose could this serve? To non-German Americans, Christmas trees seemed bizarre, wasteful, possibly pagan, definitely strange. The Puritan descendants in New England were particularly suspicious. Anything that seemed to have roots in pre-Christian practices made them nervous, and evergreen worship absolutely had pagan origins. Ancient Europeans had brought evergreen branches indoors during winter solstice celebrations, believing they held protective power against the darkness. The Germans had Christianized this practice centuries ago. By the 1600s, German families were decorating entire trees rather than just branches, making them centerpieces of their Christmas celebrations. Martin Luther himself was said to have put candles on a tree to represent stars. Though this story is probably apocryphal, but to Americans unfamiliar with German customs, the Christmas tree looked like novelty at best, idolatry at worst. The German immigrants didn't care what their neighbors thought. They wanted trees. It reminded them of home. It gave their children something beautiful to look at during dark winter nights. It made Christmas feel like Christmas was supposed to feel. So they kept doing it. Quietly at first, in their own homes, for their own families without making a fuss. In 1832, Charles Follen, a German immigrant teaching at Harvard, set up a Christmas tree in his Cambridge home. He was educated, respectable, well connected. When his tree attracted attention, it wasn't entirely negative. People were curious. What was this strange German custom? Why did Professor Follen have a pine tree in his house? Some found it charming. Children especially seemed to love it. The candles flickering in the branches, the simple decorations, strings of cranberries, paper ornaments, perhaps a few gilded nuts. But the practice didn't spread quickly. Through the 1830s and 40s, Christmas trees remained primarily a German-American tradition. You might see them in German neighborhoods in Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Wisconsin. But in mainstream American homes, still rare. The big shift came in 1848. That year, the Illustrated London News published an engraving of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert celebrating Christmas with their children around a decorated tree at Windsor Castle. Prince Albert was German. He'd brought the Christmas tree tradition to the British royal family. And when the British public saw their beloved queen standing beside a tree, suddenly Christmas trees became fashionable. The American version of that same engraving appeared in Godey's Lady's Book in 1850, strategically edited to remove the crown and royal regalia, so it looked like an American family rather than British royalty. The timing was perfect. Americans were hungry for domestic, family-centered celebrations. The Industrial Revolution was pulling people into cities, away from extended family and traditional community structures. Christmas was evolving from a rowdy public festival into a private, home-based holiday, and the Christmas tree fit that vision perfectly. It was beautiful. It was wholesome. It required the whole family to participate in decorating it. It created a focal point for domestic celebration. It said, "Look, we're a family, we have traditions, we create beauty together." By the 1860s, Christmas trees were spreading beyond German communities. Middle-class families in cities started putting them up. Magazines published instructions on how to decorate them. Merchants began selling ornaments and candle holders designed specifically for Christmas trees. The Civil War accelerated adoption. Soldiers from different ethnic and regional backgrounds mixed in army camps, shared traditions, wrote letters home describing what they'd seen. German soldiers put up Christmas trees in camp. Their non-German comrades thought it was charming, mentioned it in letters, and the practice spread. By 1870, Christmas trees were common enough that businesses started putting them up in public spaces. Hotels, theaters, department stores, all wanted trees to signal Christmas cheer and attract customers. And somewhere in this process, Americans forgot that Christmas trees had ever been foreign. By the early 1900s, when you asked an American child what Christmas looked like, they'd describe a tree. Of course there was a tree. There had always been a tree. What was Christmas without a tree? The fact that this tradition was less than a century old in America, that it had been considered strange and possibly heretical by earlier generations, had been completely forgotten. The Christmas tree had become American. So thoroughly American that people would have been surprised to learn it was originally German. This is how cultural adoption works. Something arrives as foreign. It's viewed with suspicion or curiosity. A few people try it. If it meets some need, aesthetic, social, spiritual, it spreads. Eventually, it becomes so familiar that its origins blur and people assume it's always been this way. The Christmas tree met multiple needs. It was beautiful in a season that was often gray and dark. It created work, cutting it, transporting it, decorating it, that families could do together. It gave children something to anticipate. It marked the home as a place of celebration. And once middle-class Americans decided Christmas trees were desirable, There was no going back. The tradition embedded itself so deeply that removing it would have felt like removing Christmas itself. Now, of course, we barely think about it. Christmas trees are everywhere in December. We debate real versus artificial. We argue about when to put them up and take them down. We have strong opinions about lights and ornaments, but we don't think about the fact that this tradition is imported, or that it was once controversial, or that it took generations to become universally accepted. We just accept the tree as part of Christmas, as fundamental and unquestionable as the date itself, which is exactly what happened with another imported tradition that took even longer to solidify. The first American Santa tradition, Santa Claus, did not arrive in America fully formed, wearing a red suit and driving reindeer. The evolution of American Santa is complicated, involving Dutch folklore, English traditions, German gift bringers, commercial interests, and several writers who basically invented parts of the mythology we now consider canonical. Let's start in New York. When the Dutch controlled New Amsterdam, before the English took over and renamed it New York, they brought their celebration of Sinterklaas, Saint Nicholas, a 4th century bishop from what's now Turkey, who supposedly gave gifts to poor children. The Dutch Sinterklaas arrived on December 6th, St. Nicholas Day, not December 25th. He was tall, thin, dressed in bishop's robes, and he rode a white horse. He brought gifts to good children. He was accompanied by helpers, in Dutch tradition, sometimes somewhat threatening helpers who would punish bad children. After the English took control of New York, the Dutch traditions didn't disappear immediately, but they did evolve and blend with English customs. By the late 1700s, St. Nicholas had become a vaguely remembered folk figure in New York. Some families still told stories about him. Some still exchanged gifts on December 6th, but the tradition was fading. Then came Washington Irving. In 1809, Irving published A History of New York under the pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker. It was a satirical history, not meant to be factual. In it, Irving described St. Nicholas as the patron saint of New York, depicted him riding over rooftops in a wagon, dropping gifts down chimneys. Irving made most of this up. He was playing with Dutch legends, embellishing freely, creating folklore in real time. But people read it, and some took it as genuine Dutch tradition, rather than Irving's creative invention. Then came Clement Clarke Moore. Probably. In 1823, the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas was published anonymously in a New York newspaper. It began, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. You know this poem, everyone knows this poem. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. 8 reindeer with names, down the chimney, stockings hung by the fire." The poem was attributed to Clement Clarke Moore, a wealthy New Yorker and biblical scholar, though Moore didn't publicly claim authorship until much later, and some historians think it might have been written by Henry Livingston Jr. instead. Whoever wrote it, the poem was hugely influential. It established Santa Claus, the Americanized version of St. Nicholas, as a Christmas Eve visitor, not a December 6th visitor. It moved the gift-giving from St. Nicholas Day to Christmas. It gave Santa reindeer and a sleigh. It made him cheerful, jolly, non-threatening. The poem spread rapidly. It was reprinted in newspapers across the country. Families read it aloud on Christmas Eve. Children memorized it. By the 1840s, Santa Claus was becoming a recognized Christmas figure, though he didn't look the same everywhere. Some illustrations showed him tall and thin, some short and round, some dressed in furs, some in robes, some in regular clothes. He might be elf-sized or human-sized. Sometimes he had a beard, sometimes he didn't. The red suit, that came later. Thomas Nast, a cartoonist for Harper's Weekly, drew Santa repeatedly during the 1860s through 1880s. Nast's Santa was round, bearded, wearing a fur-trimmed suit. The suit was sometimes red, sometimes brown, or tan. Nast also established that Santa lived at the North Pole, had a workshop, kept lists of who was naughty or nice. Nast was making it up as he went, but his illustrations were so popular, so widely reproduced, that they became definitive. This is what Santa looked like, according to Harper's Weekly, which was one of the most influential publications in America. By the late 1800s, Santa Claus had become standardized. Red suit, white beard, round belly, jolly disposition, North Pole residence, workshop, elves helping him, lists, reindeer-powered sleigh. None of this was traditional. All of it was invented, mostly within a 70-year span, by writers and illustrators who were building on vague European folklore and adding whatever seemed to work. The Coca-Cola Company did not invent the red-suited Santa, contrary to popular belief. That's a myth. The red suit predates Coca-Cola's 1830s advertising campaigns by decades. What Coca-Cola did was standardize and spread Nast's version through massive advertising, making it so ubiquitous that regional variations disappeared. But the basic concept, jolly man in red suit bringing gifts on Christmas Eve, was established before Coca-Cola got involved. What's interesting is how quickly this invented tradition became sacred. By the early 1900s, American children expected Santa Claus. Parents played along. Department stores hired men to dress as Santa so children could visit him. The whole elaborate fiction was maintained collectively, and it worked. Santa Claus gave Christmas a central mythological figure. He made gift-giving magical rather than transactional. He gave children someone to believe in, to write letters to perform goodness for. He also gave parents a useful fiction for encouraging behavior. Santa's watching. Santa knows if you've been bad or good. The darker edge of this, the surveillance, the conditional love, the idea that gifts must be earned through obedience, is worth noting. But most parents didn't think about it that deeply. They just wanted their kids to behave and to have some Christmas magic. The American Santa Claus was and is a strange hybrid. Part saint, part folklore, part commercial creation, part parental conspiracy. He has nothing to do with the historical Saint Nicholas, who was a 4th century bishop concerned with theology and charity, not toy distribution. He's a thoroughly American invention, pieced together from imported fragments and domestic imagination, standardized through commercial interests and mass media. And now he's so embedded in American Christmas that removing him would be unthinkable. He appears in every mall, every television special, every Christmas movie. Children write him letters. NORAD tracks his flight path on Christmas Eve. We've made him real through collective belief and performance, even though we all know he's fictional. That's a peculiarly American kind of magic. The willingness to maintain a fiction because it serves a purpose, because it makes life more interesting, because children's wonder matters more than strict adherence to truth. The early Americans who told their children about St. Nicholas on December 6th had no idea they were starting something that would eventually become this elaborate, this commercial, this central to American Christmas. They were just passing along old stories, adapting them to new circumstances, and we're still doing that. Still adapting, still inventing, still deciding what Santa Claus means and how he functions in our celebrations. But while Santa was becoming an American tradition in homes, something else was happening in public spaces that would shape how Americans experienced Christmas shopping. The rise of holiday markets and colonial winter fairs, Christmas shopping as we know it, the frantic mall trips, the online ordering, the Black Friday chaos, is a relatively recent phenomenon. But Americans have been gathering to buy things during the Christmas season for centuries. It just looked different. In colonial cities, winter markets happened throughout December and into January. These weren't Christmas markets exactly. They were winter markets that happened to occur during the Christmas season. They served practical purposes. Farmers needed to sell preserved goods before they spoiled. Artisans needed to sell inventory before the new year. City dwellers needed to stock up on supplies to get through winter. The market set up in public squares or along major streets. Vendors would build temporary stalls, sometimes just tables under canvas, sometimes more elaborate wooden structures if the weather was terrible and they'd be there for weeks. What did they sell? Food primarily. Preserved meats, dried fruits, root vegetables that stored well, wheels of cheese, jars of preserves, sacks of grain, and flour. This was before refrigeration, remember? Winter was when you ate what you'd managed to preserve from summer and fall. Plus, whatever could survive cold storage. Also, handmade goods, carved wooden items, woven baskets, pottery, iron tools, leather goods, cloth, things people had spent the autumn making, hoping to sell for coins that would carry them through winter. Sometimes imported luxuries, spices, sugar, coffee, tea, oranges or lemons brought from the Caribbean, ribbon and lace for those who could afford them. The markets were social events as much as commercial ones. You'd go to buy what you needed, sure, but you'd also go to see neighbors you hadn't seen since autumn, to hear news and gossip, to let children look at things they couldn't afford, to sample treats sold by vendors trying to attract customers. In German communities, especially Pennsylvania, winter markets had more explicit Christmas connections. Vendors sold items specifically for Christmas: candles, evergreen boughs for decoration, ingredients for special holiday baking, small toys, and gifts. Philadelphia's Christmas markets in the late 1700s and early 1800s were substantial affairs. German vendors would sell Lebkuchen, spiced cookies, and Stollen. You could buy hand-carved nativity figures, simple wooden toys, ribbons, and small trinkets suitable for gifts. Musicians sometimes performed at markets, not organized concerts, just individuals with fiddles or flutes, playing for coins, adding to the festive atmosphere. The markets were cold. Obviously, it was December. Vendors built small fires when allowed to keep warm and to make their stalls seem inviting. Customers would warm their hands while examining goods, making the purchase an excuse to linger near heat. Children loved winter markets, the sights, the sounds, the possibility of receiving a small treat, a piece of gingerbread, a candied nut, a moment of wonder in the middle of winter's hardship. For adults, the markets were more practical. You went to buy what you needed, but you also went to see what was available, what prices were like, whether anyone was selling something unusual or valuable. Sometimes you'd see goods you couldn't afford, luxuries, items imported from Europe. These were aspirational viewing. You'd look, imagine having the money to purchase them, file away the knowledge for future reference. By the early 1800s, as cities grew and commerce became more sophisticated, permanent shops started competing with seasonal markets. General stores, specialty shops, even early department stores. These offered year-round shopping in more comfortable environments. But the markets persisted because they offered something shops couldn't: variety from multiple vendors in one location, the social atmosphere, the sense of event rather than errand. The modern American Christmas market, the kind that sets up in city squares with cute wooden chalets selling hot chocolate and handmade ornaments, is actually a recent reimportation of European tradition. These markets became popular in the United States in the 1980s and 90s, inspired by German Christkindl markets and modeled on European aesthetics. But they're echoing something that used to exist here. The colonial and early federal winter markets weren't as cute or as deliberately themed. They were working markets that happened to occur during Christmas season. Still, the basic impulse was the same: gather in public during the darkest, coldest time of year, exchange goods, see each other, create a sense that life continues, community persists, even in winter. The early American markets were where you might buy the ingredients for a Christmas dinner, the ribbon to trim a child's new dress, the candles that would make Christmas Eve feel special. They were where artisans sold the wooden toys and carved items that would become Christmas gifts. They connected rural and urban economies. Farmers brought what they'd grown and preserved. City artisans sold what they'd made. Everyone benefited, and the market became a meeting place across class and geography. There was music, conversation, the smell of roasting nuts and baking bread. There was the visual interest of goods displayed, the colors and textures making winter less monochrome. And there was the possibility, small but real, of finding something unexpected, something beautiful or useful or delightful that you hadn't known existed until you saw it at a vendor's stall. That possibility, that sense of discovery, is what good markets create. Not just transaction, but experience. Not just buying, but encountering. The best modern holiday markets capture this. They're not just shopping venues, they're destinations. Places where you go to be cold together, to drink something warm, to walk around, looking at things, to feel part of a seasonal tradition. The worst ones are just outdoor malls with a Christmas theme, transactional, impersonal, existing only to extract money from holiday shoppers. The difference is whether the market creates community or just facilitates commerce. Early American winter markets created community by necessity. People needed each other. Vendors needed buyers. Buyers needed goods. Everyone needed the social connection that came from gathering in public space during a season that otherwise isolated them on farms and in homes. We don't have that same necessity now. We can order anything online, have it delivered without ever seeing another human, but the desire for those markets persists. The desire to gather, to shop in person, to make purchasing an event rather than a task. That desire is old, older than Christmas shopping as we know it. Older than American Christmas itself. It's the human need to come together, especially when the world is dark and cold, to create warmth through proximity, to remind ourselves that we're not alone. The colonial winter markets serve that need. The Christmas markets that are popping up in American cities today serve it too. Different contexts, different specific traditions, but the same underlying impulse. And maybe that's the real story of how Christmas symbols became American. Not through any single tradition or innovation, but through this repeated pattern. Humans finding ways to create light in darkness, warmth in cold, community in isolation. Christmas trees did that. Santa Claus did that. Markets did that. They gave people something to gather around, something to create together, something to anticipate and remember. They took the raw fact of winter, that it's dark and cold and hard, and said, okay, but we can make it beautiful anyway. We can bring trees inside. We can tell stories to children. We can gather in squares and sell each other things we've made. We can transform necessity into celebration. That's what early Americans did with Christmas. They took imported traditions, practical needs, and human desires, mixed them together, and created something new. Something that felt both timeless and innovative, both sacred and commercial, both private and public. Something that served multiple purposes at once: religious observance, social bonding, economic exchange, family celebration, childhood wonder. Christmas became American by becoming all of these things simultaneously, by refusing to be just one thing, by accommodating multiple visions and purposes and meanings. The tree could be a Christian symbol and a pagan holdover and a beautiful decoration all at once. Santa could be a saint and a myth and a marketing tool and a parental fiction. Markets could be commerce and community and Christmas tradition. All of these contradictions, all of this complexity, that's what made these symbols stick. They were flexible enough to mean different things to different people, adaptable enough to survive changing circumstances, meaningful enough to matter, but not so rigid that they couldn't evolve. And so they became permanent fixtures of American Christmas, these imported, adapted, transformed traditions. We put up trees without thinking about German immigrants or Queen Victoria or the decades it took for the practice to spread. We tell our children about Santa without considering Washington Irving or Clement Clark Moore or Thomas Nast or the complex evolution of the mythology. We shop at holiday markets without connecting them to colonial winter fairs or thinking about how commerce and community have always intertwined during this season. We just do these things because they're what you do at Christmas. They feel traditional, timeless, American, and in a sense, they are. They've been American long enough, have been practiced by enough generations, that their foreign origins and recent inventions don't matter anymore. They're ours now. We've made them ours through repetition and adaptation and the slow accretion of meaning that comes from generations of practice. The symbols have become inseparable from the holiday. You can't imagine American Christmas without them, which means the early Americans succeeded. They took fragments from elsewhere, needs from their own lives, and created traditions strong enough to last centuries, strong enough to feel permanent, even though we know they're not. Even though we know they all had to begin somewhere, had to be introduced and adopted and spread. Everything starts somewhere. Every tradition was once new. The early Americans knew this. They lived through it. They were the ones introducing Christmas trees to skeptical neighbors, telling their children about Santa for the first time, setting up winter markets, and hoping people would come. They couldn't have known these practices would endure, would spread, would eventually define American Christmas for generations to come. They were just doing what made sense at the time, what brought beauty or joy or community or commerce into their lives during the dark season, and somehow, through choices and accidents and gradual cultural evolution, those practices became the symbols we now consider essential to Christmas. Not through any grand plan, through accumulation, through people choosing year after year to keep doing something because it worked, because it mattered, because it made winter more bearable. That's how traditions are made. Slowly, imperfectly, through consensus that emerges over time rather than through any deliberate decree. The early Americans built Christmas traditions the same way they built everything else in America, by trial and error, by borrowing and adapting, by seeing what worked and keeping it, by letting what didn't work fade away. And what worked, the trees, the Santa, the markets, those endured. Those became the symbols we inherited, the traditions we now maintain, adapt, and will eventually pass on to whoever comes after us. Still evolving, still changing, still becoming whatever Christmas needs to be for the next generation. Just like it did for all the generations before us, going back to those first German immigrants putting up trees while their neighbors watched in confusion, wondering what on earth they were thinking. How these traditions shaped the nation. So here we are. We've watched Christmas evolve from a banned holiday in Puritan, Massachusetts, to elaborate Southern feasts, to quiet German traditions, to rowdy mumming, to gunfire celebrations, to handmade gifts, to imported symbols that became thoroughly American. Now we need to ask, so what? Why does any of this matter? How did these forgotten, strange, contested traditions shape the nation we live in now? Because they did, in ways both obvious and subtle, in ways that still affect how we think about work, family, community, and celebration. Let's talk about that. From controversial holiday to national celebration, Christmas didn't become a federal holiday in the United States until 1870. Read that again. 1870. Less than 200 years ago. Well after the Civil War. After the Transcontinental Railroad. After millions of immigrants had arrived, bringing their own traditions. For most of American history, Christmas was not an official holiday. Whether you celebrated it, how you celebrated it, whether you got the day off work, all of that was negotiable, regional, dependent on your employer's goodwill or ethnic background or religious affiliation. In the early 1800s, stores and businesses in many cities stayed open on December 25th. Banks operated. Courts held sessions. If you wanted the day off, you had to negotiate it individually, and your employer might say no. The slow acceptance of Christmas as a legitimate, universal holiday tracks the evolution of American identity itself. In the 1700s and early 1800s, America was a collection of distinct regional cultures that happened to share a government. New England looked nothing like the South. The Mid-Atlantic was different from both. The frontier had its own concerns entirely. These regions disagreed about everything: slavery, tariffs, the role of federal government, westward expansion, immigration, religion. They also disagreed about Christmas, but gradually, through the 1800s, something shifted. Immigration increased. Germans, Irish, Italians, Scandinavians, millions of people arriving, bringing their Christmas traditions with them. The sheer volume of people who considered Christmas important made it harder to ignore or dismiss. Urbanization created new social patterns. Factory workers needed holidays. The constant grind of industrial labor required breaks, moments of rest, or workers would literally break down. Christmas became one of those necessary pauses. The Civil War mixed populations in unprecedented ways. Soldiers from different states, different backgrounds, different traditions all served together. They shared their customs. A New England soldier might experience his first Christmas tree in a camp alongside German soldiers. A Southern soldier might participate in Christmas Eve caroling, organized by Midwestern chaplains. When these soldiers came home, they brought new ideas about how Christmas could be celebrated. Regional differences began to blur. By the 1850s and 60s, middle-class Americans were developing a shared vision of Christmas. It involved trees, gifts, family gatherings, special meals, religious observance for those who wanted it, secular celebration for those who didn't. Writers reinforced this vision. Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, was wildly popular in America. It presented Christmas as a time for generosity, family, redemption, and goodwill. Americans loved it. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Louisa May Alcott, and other American writers published Christmas stories that emphasized domestic warmth, family love, and charitable impulses. These stories created a template for what Christmas should be. The template was middle class, domestic, sentimental, and non-threatening to existing power structures. It transformed rowdy, potentially dangerous celebrations into private, family-centered observances. This was not accidental. As America industrialized, as cities grew more crowded, as class tensions increased, there was genuine anxiety about public disorder. Mumming, wassailing, Christmas gunning, all of these traditions involved groups of people, often drinking, moving through public spaces in unpredictable ways. The new vision of Christmas moved celebration indoors, into private homes, under parental supervision. It was safer, more controlled, less likely to result in property damage or social conflict. By the time Christmas became a federal holiday in 1870, this transformation was largely complete. Christmas had been domesticated, tamed, made safe for middle class consumption. The fact that it took until 1870 for the federal government to recognize Christmas tells you how controversial it had been, how much resistance there was to mandating a religious holiday in a country that claimed to separate church and state. But by 1870, Christmas had become secular enough, commercial enough, culturally dominant enough that the religious objections carried less weight. Everyone was celebrating it anyway. Making it official just acknowledged reality. State by state, region by region, Christmas had already become an unofficial national holiday. People expected the day off. Businesses closed. Schools dismissed students. The federal declaration simply formalized what had already happened through cultural consensus. And in that formalization, Christmas became something new. An American holiday. Not just a religious observance, not just a cultural tradition, an American institution, part of the national identity, something that defined what it meant to be American in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Because once Christmas became a national holiday, it had to accommodate everyone. All regions, all classes, multiple religions, and even people with no religion. It had to be flexible enough to mean different things to different people while still feeling coherent as a shared experience. And it managed that trick. Somehow, Christmas became the holiday where you could be religious or secular, traditional or innovative, lavish or modest, and still be participating in the same national observance. That flexibility, that refusal to be just one thing, is very American. We're a nation of contradictions, of competing visions, of people who disagree about almost everything except that we're all American. Christmas became a holiday that reflected that complexity, that accommodated it, that said, yes, we're all different, but we can all celebrate this day in our own way, and it still counts. That's a remarkable achievement if you think about it. Creating a holiday that's simultaneously Christian and secular, religious and commercial, traditional and constantly evolving, deeply personal and massively public. Only America could have created this particular version of Christmas. Only a nation this diverse, this commercial, this contradictory could have taken fragments from multiple European traditions and blended them into something both familiar and unique. And the foundation for all of this was laid in the colonial period, when different groups were experimenting with different ways of observing December 25th, arguing about whether it should be observed at all, slowly building the traditions that would eventually merge into something recognizable as American Christmas. But making Christmas a national holiday was only part of the transformation. The more profound change was what happened to how people celebrated. The transition toward family-centered Christmas. In 1750, if you celebrated Christmas at all, you probably celebrated it with your community, with neighbors, church members, people from your town or plantation. Christmas was social, public, collective. By 1900, Christmas had become primarily a family holiday. Private, domestic, centered on the nuclear family unit. This shift fundamentally changed what Christmas meant and what it was for. The old Christmas, the mumming, wassailing, gunfire, communal feasting kind, was about community cohesion, about reinforcing social bonds across the neighborhood or parish, about seeing and being seen by your wider community. It was loud. It happened in public spaces and other people's homes. It required participation from people outside your immediate family. It was hard to opt out of without social consequences. The new Christmas, the tree Santa, family dinner kind, was about the nuclear family. Parents and children, the home as sanctuary, the family as the primary unit of identity and belonging. This shift happened gradually, starting in the early 1800s and accelerating through the mid to late century. Why? Multiple factors. Urbanization meant people lived among strangers rather than lifelong neighbors. You couldn't have rowdy communal celebrations with people you didn't know and didn't trust. Industrialization changed work patterns. People worked in factories or offices rather than on family farms. Work and home became separate spheres. Home became precious, a refuge from the public world of labor and commerce. The rise of the middle class created new ideas about privacy, domesticity, and childhood. Middle class families wanted homes that were private retreats, not just places where you slept between work shifts. Changing ideas about childhood played a huge role. In the colonial period, children were essentially small adults who contributed labor to the household economy. By the mid 1800s, childhood was increasingly seen as a special, protected time. Children needed nurturing, education, moral formation. They needed magic and wonder. Christmas became a vehicle for providing that magic. The family Christmas centered around children. The tree was for them to admire. Santa Claus was for them to believe in. Gifts were primarily for them to receive. Parents created elaborate performances of Christmas, staying up late to arrange gifts, maintaining the Santa fiction, orchestrating the perfect Christmas morning. This made Christmas more work, especially for women. Mothers were expected to do most of the planning, shopping, decorating, cooking, and orchestrating. Christmas became another aspect of the intensive domestic labor expected of middle-class wives, but it also made Christmas more emotionally significant. It became the day when families demonstrated their love through material provision and domestic performance, when parents proved they cared by creating the perfect celebration, when children learned they were valued through the gifts they received and the effort adults expended on their behalf. The Victorian-era Christmas, the version that solidified in the late 1800s and still dominates our cultural imagination, was built around the idea that Christmas should be perfect. The tree should be beautiful, the meal should be abundant, the gifts should delight. The family should be happy, harmonious, grateful. This created impossible standards that we're still trying to meet, because perfect is exhausting. Perfect requires money, time, energy, emotional labor. Perfect assumes functional families, stable finances, mental and physical health. And most families in any era don't have all of those things simultaneously, but the ideal persisted, still persists. The vision of the perfect family Christmas, everyone gathered around the tree, opening gifts, eating together, loving each other in that warm, Norman Rockwell way. We compare our actual Christmases to that ideal and find them wanting. Too much stress, too much expense, too much family conflict, too much feeling like we're failing at something we're supposed to naturally excel at. This anxiety is built into the modern family-centered Christmas. It was there from the beginning, in the 1850s and 60s, when middle-class magazines were publishing articles about how to create the perfect Christmas, and women were reading them and feeling inadequate. The transition from communal to family-centered Christmas created this pressure, made Christmas higher stakes, made it about proving something, that you're a good parent, a good spouse, a good family member, rather than just celebrating with whoever was around. But it also created something valuable. It made Christmas intimate, personal, specific to your particular family and its traditions. When Christmas was primarily communal, it was determined by larger social forces. The church told you how to observe it. The community expected certain behaviors. You couldn't really customize it. When Christmas became family-centered, it became yours to shape. You could create your own traditions specific to your family, special breakfast foods, particular decorating styles, unique gift opening rituals. This personalization meant that Christmas memories became more vivid, more emotionally resonant, because they were about your specific family, not just generic community celebration. The Christmas you remember from childhood is probably family centered. Specific moments, decorating the tree with your parents, Christmas morning in pajamas, your grandmother's particular way of cooking something, the year you got that one special gift. Those memories are powerful because they're personal. Because Christmas became the time when your family was most intensely itself, when traditions specific to your household were enacted and reinforced. That's the gift of family centered Christmas, even with all its stress and impossible standards. It created space for families to develop their own culture, their own mythology, their own ways of marking time and creating meaning. The early Americans who began this transition, who started putting up trees in their parlors instead of going out mumming, who started focusing on their children instead of their neighbors, they were responding to changing circumstances, new work patterns, new living arrangements, new ideas about what family should be. They couldn't have known they were creating the template for modern Christmas, the version that would dominate the next 2 centuries, the version we're still performing, still struggling with, still trying to perfect. They were just adapting, doing what made sense for their new urban, industrial, middle-class lives. And what made sense was bringing celebration home, making it private, making it about the people you love most rather than the community you happen to live among. For better and worse, that's the Christmas we inherited. Family-centered, emotionally intense, impossibly high standards, deeply personal. And woven through all of it from the beginning was this other impulse that early Americans were also developing. The roots of today's giving culture. Americans give more to charity than people in any other country. We donate billions annually. We volunteer. We organize drives. We sponsor families. We adopt angels from trees. A lot of this happens around Christmas. This isn't coincidental. American Christmas and American charity culture grew up together, influencing each other, creating feedback loops that still shape both. The early American Christmas charity we talked about earlier, wealthy families preparing baskets for the poor, that was just the beginning. By the mid-1800s, Christmas charity was becoming institutionalized. Churches organized collections. Charitable societies held special Christmas campaigns. Settlement houses threw Christmas parties for poor children. In 1843, Dickens published A Christmas Carol, and it gave the charitable impulse narrative form. Scrooge learns that wealth means nothing if you don't help others, that Christmas is the time to be generous, to notice people in need, to give. American readers loved this message. It fit emerging ideas about social responsibility, about the obligations of the wealthy, about Christmas as a time when normal rules of economic competition should be temporarily suspended in favor of generosity. By the late 1800s, Christmas charity had become expected, not optional. If you had resources, you were supposed to share them at Christmas. Churches expected donations. Charitable organizations expected contributions. Communities expected the wealthy to sponsor Christmas baskets or parties for the poor. The Salvation Army began its Christmas Kettle campaign in 1891 in San Francisco. The idea spread rapidly. By the early 1900s, Salvation Army kettles were fixtures of urban Christmas, familiar sights outside department stores, constant reminders that Christmas involved giving to those less fortunate. Newspaper stories about poor children who wouldn't have Christmas unless charitable readers donated became standard seasonal content. The stories were often sentimental, sometimes manipulative, but they worked. People gave. This created a specifically American approach to poverty and charity. Rather than systematic social support, Americans developed a culture of individual giving. Rather than permanent solutions, we created seasonal generosity. Rather than questioning why poverty existed, we focus on alleviating its worst effects during the holidays. This approach has limitations. Christmas charity doesn't solve systemic poverty. It doesn't provide year round support. It can be condescending, paternalistic, more about making donors feel good than about actually helping recipients. But it also mobilizes enormous resources. It gets people who normally ignore poverty to pay attention, at least briefly. It creates cultural permission for generosity that might not exist otherwise. And it's deeply connected to the Christmas traditions we've been discussing. The handmade gifts, the emphasis on thoughtfulness over expense, those taught Americans that giving should be personal, intentional about the specific needs of the recipient. The family centered celebration created contrast with those who didn't have families or resources, making their need more visible and urgent during the holiday season. The transformation of Christmas into a national holiday made charity a national concern. If we're all celebrating, we should ensure everyone can participate. If Christmas is American, then no American should be without Christmas. This logic drove, and still drives, enormous charitable efforts. Toy drives so poor children receive gifts. Food drives so everyone has Christmas dinner. Coat drives so no one is cold. Angel trees where you can sponsor a specific child or family. These programs are uniquely American in their combination of individualism and collective action. They ask individuals to give directly, person to person, but organize those individual acts into large-scale efforts. They preserve the personal element. You're helping a specific child, a specific family, while achieving the reach of institutional programs. This both is and isn't what early Americans were doing when they prepared Christmas baskets for the poor. The personal element remains, the sense that Christmas involves seeing and helping people in need. The belief that those who have resources should share them. But the scale has changed dramatically. Colonial Christmas charity might help a dozen families in your immediate community. Modern Christmas charity can reach millions, and something has been lost in that expansion. The face-to-face contact, the direct knowledge of need, the relationship between giver and recipient, however unequal and problematic that relationship was. Modern charity is often anonymous. You donate online, you drop coins in a kettle, you buy a gift for a child whose name you don't know and whose face you'll never see. This anonymity is more efficient, more scalable, less paternalistic in some ways. The recipient doesn't have to perform gratitude for a specific donor, but it's also less connected, less human, more transactional. Early American Christmas charity, for all its problems, required seeing the people you were helping, required some level of relationship, however unequal. Modern Christmas charity can be entirely abstract. A tax deduction, a feel-good moment in the checkout line, a way to assuage guilt without actually encountering poverty. Both versions, early and modern, reflect American values and American contradictions. We believe in individual responsibility and collective celebration. We believe in generosity and capitalism. We believe everyone deserves Christmas, and also that poverty is somehow your own fault. We create elaborate charitable systems and refuse to provide systematic social support. We give billions during the holidays and underfund social services year-round. These contradictions were there from the beginning. In colonial households preparing Christmas baskets while maintaining slavery, in northern cities collecting for the poor while paying workers starvation wages. Christmas charity has always been about managing these contradictions, about creating moments of generosity that don't challenge fundamental inequalities, about making poverty more bearable without actually eliminating it. This is not a comfortable conclusion, but it's honest. The American Christmas giving culture is real, powerful, capable of mobilizing tremendous resources and genuine compassion. It's also limited, sometimes hypocritical, more focused on symptoms than causes. Both things are true. Both come from the same historical roots, the same colonial and early American traditions we've been discussing. The impulse to give, the belief that Christmas should include everyone, the sense that celebration and charity are connected. These are gifts from early Americans. These are part of what they built and what we inherited. Whether we use them well, whether we build on them or let them atrophy into mere performance, that's up to us. Just like Christmas itself, the giving culture is what we make it. It can be genuine or performative, transformative or merely alleviating, personal or abstract. Early Americans showed us possibilities. They created templates. They established that Christmas involved generosity, involved noticing those with less, involved trying to ensure that joy wasn't restricted to those who could afford it. What we do with those templates, how we adapt them to our circumstances, whether we honor the spirit behind them or just go through the motions, that's our choice. That's our inheritance and our responsibility. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson from these forgotten Christmas traditions in early America. They weren't perfect. They were contradictory, contested, constantly evolving. They reflected the best and worst of the people who practiced them. But they were genuine attempts to create meaning, build community, mark time, and make winter more bearable. They gave us Christmas as we know it, with all its beauty and stress, its generosity and commercialism, its joy and impossible standards. They gave us a holiday that's simultaneously sacred and secular, personal and national, traditional and constantly changing. A holiday that reflects America itself, contradictory, diverse, commercial, idealistic, never quite living up to its own aspirations, but somehow still trying. That's the real gift from early Americans. Not any specific tradition, but the understanding that celebration matters enough to argue about, to adapt, to preserve, and transform. That Christmas is worth the effort even when we get it wrong, even when it's stressful and commercial and nothing like the ideal we're chasing. It's still worth gathering, still worth giving, still worth creating light in darkness and warmth in cold. Still worth passing down to whoever comes next, knowing they'll adapt it further, change it in ways we can't predict, make it theirs just as we made it ours and early Americans made it theirs. The tradition continues, imperfect, evolving, American, and we're part of it, whether we realize it or not, carrying forward what was given to us, shaping it with our choices, preparing to hand it off. That's what early Americans did. That's what we're doing. That's what the future will do. And somehow, through all the changes and contradictions and forgotten traditions and new inventions, Christmas endures. Not because it's perfect, because it's ours. Because we keep choosing it, keep celebrating it, keep trying to make it mean something. Just like the colonists who started this whole strange tradition, who couldn't have known where it would lead but did it anyway. Because winter needed marking, because community mattered, because celebration, however imperfect, was better than nothing. They were right about that, and we're still learning from them, still following the paths they started, still building on foundations they laid, still trying to have Christmas, still figuring out what that means, still carrying their traditions forward, transformed but recognizable into whatever future we're creating. That's the legacy. That's what endures. Not the specific customs, most of which we've forgotten or changed beyond recognition, but the impulse behind them, the human need they served, the community they built. That's what early American Christmas gave us. and that ultimately is worth remembering. And that brings us to the present day, where we put up trees without thinking about German immigrants, tell our children about Santa without considering the mythology we're collectively maintaining, and stress about creating the perfect family Christmas while carrying forward contradictions that are centuries old. So the next time you're overwhelmed by holiday shopping, or exhausted from decorating, or wondering how Christmas became this complicated, just remember your ancestors were firing muskets at dawn, letting masked strangers into their homes, and arguing about whether celebrating December 25th was a sin. We've always struggled with Christmas. We've always felt like we're doing it wrong. We've always inherited impossible standards and then added our own. You're participating in a tradition that's 400 years old, trying to celebrate Christmas while having no idea if you're doing it right. You're in good company. Sleep well.